Her youngest had stopped asking for food 3 days ago. That was the thing that frightened Ruth Calloway more than the snow piled 4 feet against the door, more than the flour sack that weighed nothing when she lifted it, more than the wind working the cabin walls like something with a personal grievance. A hungry child cries. A child who has stopped crying has started accepting. She was not going to let her children accept this. Her husband Rolf had ridden for Bitter Creek Station on January 28th when the first storm broke. A fast ride, meant to be back in 2 days with flour and salted pork. That was 6 days ago. The second storm had come in behind the first without a gap between them, the way bad things sometimes arrive on the high Wyoming plain, stacked and relentless. The door faced north, and the drift against it had grown 3 inches overnight. She had stopped trying to open it. 3 children, Agnes, 9, Thomas, 6, the baby, Marin, 14 months and nursing still, though Ruth's milk had thinned to almost nothing in the cold. The cabin was 18 feet by 14, one iron stove burning through the last of the split pine at a rate that terrified her every time she opened the firebox. 2 windows, the south one sealed in ice on the outside, but still transmitting pale winter light in the afternoon. The north window she had packed with rags and a folded blanket on day 2. She had a single asset she had not yet fully used. It was not firewood. It was not food. It was a cloth sack of mixed garden seeds she had ordered from a seed house in Cheyenne the previous spring. Iron-clad turnip, winter cress, and 2 varieties of radish bred for short seasons. The sack had sat on the shelf all summer and autumn because the kitchen garden had outproduced it. She had meant to return it. She had not gotten around to it. Looking at it now, in the gray light of a February morning, with 3 quiet children watching her from the rope bed, she understood that not getting around to it had been the most important thing she had ever accidentally done. She had read about hotbed gardening in an almanac 2 winters prior. The principle had lodged in her mind the way useful things do. Not because she planned to use it, but because it was strange enough to stick. Decomposing organic matter generates heat. A compost pile in July runs hot enough to blister a hand pushed into its center. She had tested it herself out of curiosity and pulled her fingers back fast, surprised. That heat did not care about the temperature outside. It came from inside the material itself, from the invisible work of breakdown, and it ran steady and low and long, nothing like a fire's spike and fade. It ran at 50 to 60 degrees. She had read that twice to make sure she had it right. 50 to 60 degrees was warm enough to germinate seeds. The goat was the key. She had one, a small brown Nubian doe named Ferdy, who had been sharing the cabin's south corner since the storm started, contributing warmth and noise and a smell that Agnes complained about with feeling. Ferdy had been eating the last of the hay bale and the accumulated waste beneath her hooves. Old hay, manure, the damp litter of 10 days of confinement had built into a dense, reeking mat, roughly 8 inches deep. Ruth had been meaning to clear it. She had not. Now she stood at the south wall with a shovel and looked at it differently. She needed heat from below. The almanac had been specific. A hotbed worked because the decomposing mass sat beneath the growing medium, pushing warmth upward through the soil and into the root zone of the plants. The geometry of it was simple. She needed a pit, a mass of active compost at the bottom, a layer of soil above it, and something to seal the heat in at the top. She looked at the window. The south window was 12 inches tall and 20 inches wide, set in a pine frame that Rolf had built flush with the interior wall. The glass was single pane, old, with a faint greenish tint she had always found beautiful in the afternoon light. She needed that glass horizontal, not vertical. She needed it flat over a growing pit, letting light in from above while holding warmth below. She could not take the window out of the wall without letting the storm into the cabin. But the floor was a different matter. She put the children at the table with the last of the cornmeal mush and picked up the pry bar. The floorboards ran east to west, pine planks an inch thick and 6 inches wide, fitted close but not nailed everywhere. Rolf had built in haste, and there were stretches where the boards rested on the joists by weight alone. She worked the pry bar under the first board beside the south wall, directly below the window, and levered it up. It came free with a groan that made Thomas look up from his bowl. She pulled it clear and set it aside. The second board, The third, the fourth. What she uncovered was raw earth, dark, frozen at the surface, smelling of mineral cold and old grass. She drove the shovel into it. The blade skidded off the top inch of frozen crust, and she put her boot on the shoulder of the shovel and drove it harder. The crust cracked. Below it, 4 inches down, the earth gave. Not warm, not soft, but yielding. The way earth yields when the deep cold has not reached it yet. She worked for 2 hours without stopping. By the time Agnes cleared the bowls and Thomas dragged Marin back from the edge of the pit by one arm, Ruth had dug a trench 14 inches deep, 20 inches wide, and 3 feet long, directly below the south window, positioned so that afternoon light would fall straight down through the glass into whatever grew there. Her shoulders burned. Her palms had blistered through her wool gloves on the shovel handle. She climbed out of the trench and looked at it, and then looked at the mat of manure and old hay in Ferdy's corner. She took a breath. Then she started shoveling the goat's bedding into the trench. It went in 4 inches deep, packed down with the back of the shovel until it was dense and even. The smell was considerable. Agnes covered her face with her sleeve. Thomas watched with the focused expression of a boy, deciding whether this was interesting or alarming. Ruth tamped the compost layer flat and pressed her palm into it. Nothing yet. The material was cold from the open floor, but she had read that it needed only a day to begin working. Once packed and covered, and the cabin's residual warmth would help it along. Over the compost, she spread 2 inches of soil scraped from the frozen ground at the trench edges, the loose, darker earth from below the frost line. Then she opened the seed packet. She pressed the seeds in with her thumb. Winter cress along the north edge of the trench, where it would get the most reflected warmth from the wall. Radishes in the center, where the soil depth was greatest. 2 rows of turnip seed along the south edge, tight under the window line. She covered them with a thin scraping of loose soil and smoothed it flat with her palm. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the specific exhaustion of a woman who has been running on nothing but necessity for 6 days and has just made the most important bet of her life. She lifted the south window from its frame. It was heavier than she expected. The pine sash added weight, and the cold that rushed in through the opening hit her face like a thrown pail of water. She worked fast. Rolf had built a shallow interior ledge along the bottom of the window frame to hold the sash when it was open for summer ventilation. She set the window glass flat across the trench opening, resting the frame on the floorboards on either side, the glass sitting level and tight. The fit was not perfect. A gap of perhaps a 1/4 inch ran along the south edge where the frame bowed slightly. She packed it with a strip of torn flour sacking pressed into the gap with her thumbnail. The wind came through the empty window frame above where the glass had sat. She had anticipated this. She nailed 2 layers of canvas over the opening, tacking the edges down with the small finish nails from Rolf's wooden toolbox under the bed, hammering them in with the back of the pry bar until the canvas was taut and cold air stopped moving across her wrists. She stood back and looked at what she had built. It was rough. The glass sat at a slight tilt because the floor was not perfectly level. The canvas above it moved in the draft that found its way around the tacking nails. The goat watched from her corner with mild, skeptical eyes. The 3 children stood in a row at a distance that suggested they were reserving judgment. But below the glass, sealed from the killing air above, was 14 inches of earth and decomposing heat and 40 days' worth of seeds. She fed the stove 2 splits of pine, the third to last pieces in the stack, and sat down on the edge of the rope bed and did not let herself think about the day after tomorrow. She thought about today. Today the seeds were in the ground. Today the compost would begin to work. Today the glass was on and the cold was out. That was enough for today. The first thing she noticed on the morning of the 3rd day was the smell. Not the sharp cold and pine smell the cabin had held all winter, not the goat smell from the south corner. Something underneath those, low and rich and damp. The smell of earth doing what earth does when it is warm and wet and alive. Ruth sat up in the rope bed before full light and breathed it in and felt something move in her chest that had not moved in a week. She crossed the cabin in her sock feet and knelt beside the glass panel. The underside of the glass was fogged. A fine condensation ran in slow beads down the inner face, pooling at the low edge where the frame bowed. That moisture meant warmth. She pressed her palm to the glass surface and held it. Through the pane, she could feel heat rising, Not the aggressive heat of the iron stove, but something steadier, patient, pushing upward from below, the way a buried coal pushes heat through the ash above it. The compost was working. She lifted one corner of the glass carefully and slid 2 fingers into the soil. The surface layer was cool against her skin, but 2 inches down the temperature changed. She pushed her fingers deeper, past the root zone, into the upper edge of the compost layer. Warm, genuinely, steadily warm, the way the underside of a sleeping dog is warm. Not from fire, from living process. She pressed her forehead to the glass and looked. Nothing yet. The soil surface was dark and smooth and still, but she had not expected anything yet, and she was not discouraged. Seeds germinating in cold soil took 5 days minimum, and the compost had only been running 3. She was operating on a timeline she could not afford to be impatient with. She replaced the glass and stood up and went to feed what remained of the pine. The storm had dropped 3 more feet of snow on day 4 and 5. The north wall ticked and groaned under the load, and she had spent half a day reinforcing the 2 interior support posts with wedges she split from the broken floorboards, driving them in with the pry bar until they seated hard and the groaning stopped. The south side of the roof held a smaller drift. The pitch there shed snow faster, but even so, the window canvas bowed inward in gusts, and she had added a 3rd layer of tacking. On day 5, she faced the decision she had been putting off. Ferdy still had hay. Barely. 2 days' worth at normal feeding. The goat had stopped producing milk on day 3. Stress and inadequate feed. Nothing to be done about that. But she was still warm and still breathing and still standing at the center of Ruth's heating plan. The compost trench needed fresh material added at the edges to maintain its temperature as the initial mass settled and cooled. She had watched it carefully, and by day 5, the glass condensation was thinner than on day 3. The soil at depth slightly less warm to the touch. The reaction was slowing. She had a choice. Feed Ferdy the remaining hay and keep the goat healthy, or pack the hay into the trench perimeter where it would mix with existing material and give the compost a second wind. She could not do both. The hay was spoken for either way. The question was whether it went into the goat's stomach or into the ground. She stood in the south corner for a long time looking at Ferdy. The goat looked back with the calm, incurious expression of an animal that has decided to trust the situation. Ruth forked half the remaining hay into the trench margins and packed it down with the shovel handle. She gave Ferdy the other half and a long scratch between the ears and said she was sorry and meant it. Then she replaced the glass and pressed her palm to it and waited. By evening, the condensation had returned to the underside, heavier than before. By the following morning, day 6, she lifted the glass and found what she had been waiting for, a thread of white, then another, then a dozen, pale and curved, pushing up through the dark soil like something that had decided the cold was not its problem. Winter cress, always the fastest. The cotyledon leaves had not opened yet. They were still folded tight, the seed leaves pressed together like hands, but the stems had broken ground, and they were vertical and alive. And Ruth Calloway sat back on her heels on the cold cabin floor and pressed her fist to her mouth and did not make a sound because the children were still sleeping, and she was not ready to say it out loud yet. By day 7, the cress had opened its first true leaves, small, pale green, translucent at the edges where the light came through them. The radishes had broken ground in 2 spots. The turnip seeds had not moved yet, but she was not worried about them. Turnips were stubborn starters, and she had given them the deepest soil. Agnes was the first to notice. She had been watching the glass panel from a careful distance, the way children watch things they are not sure they are allowed to touch, and on the morning of day 7, she crouched down and pressed her nose to the glass and said, quiet and certain, "They're growing." Thomas came to look. Marin crawled. Ruth stood behind all 3 of them and watched them watching the green. It was not food yet, not even close to food. The cress would be barely harvestable in another 10 days if the temperature held, the radishes in 2 weeks, the turnips in 3 or 4, and she was not counting on the turnips at all. What she had was not a meal. What she had was proof, and proof was its own kind of nourishment. But she was burning through the last of the wood, and the cold was not lifting, and the canvas over the empty window frame was not airtight, and she had not eaten anything of substance herself in 4 days, giving every scrap of real food to the children and drinking broth made from boiled bones she had cracked with the pry bar. Her hands shook when she lifted the tin cup. On the morning of day 8, she woke before light and lay in the dark and listened to the breathing of the children and understood clearly that warmth alone was not going to carry them through. She needed light for the plants, more light than the pale winter afternoon gave through the frosted canvas and the angled glass. And she had one thing left she had not yet spent. On the shelf above the window, wrapped in a piece of the flower sacking to protect it from the cold, was a silver hand mirror, her mother's. Oval frame, 8 inches across, the silver tarnished to a warm gray at the edges, but clear at the center. She had carried it from Illinois in a trunk in 1882, and it had sat on that shelf for 6 years, and she had never once in 6 years considered it a tool. She took it down and held it. The afternoon light came through the canvas in a diffuse, directionless pale that fell evenly over the whole floor and gave the plants something but not enough. She angled the mirror toward the canvas and caught what light existed and threw it down at the glass panel and watched the brightness move across the soil surface like a slow hand. The cress turned toward it, not all at once, gradually, the way plants move, too slow to see directly, apparent only when you looked away and then looked back. The pale stems leaned a fraction of a degree toward the concentrated light, the leaves opening wider to catch it. She sat on the floor in front of the mirror for 3 hours that first afternoon, holding it at the angle that threw the most light onto the plants, until her arm burned from shoulder to wrist, and Thomas came and held it for 30 minutes while she rested, not because she asked him to, but because he had been watching and understood without being told. She fed it this way for 4 days. Every clear sky hour, the mirror caught and concentrated whatever light the clouds allowed and threw it down through the glass. Agnes took the second shift each day. Thomas took the third. They rotated without complaint, with the focused seriousness of children who understand that what they are doing matters. The cress grew. On day 10, she cut the first leaves with the small folding knife she kept in her apron pocket, barely a tablespoon of green material per plant. Thin and sharp-tasting and alive. She divided it into 3 portions, one for each child, and watched them eat it. Thomas made a face at the bitterness. Agnes ate hers without expression. Marin grabbed at it with both hands and got most of it in her hair, which was normal for Marin. It was not enough to sustain anyone. It was enough to matter. The radishes were swelling at their roots, faint pink color showing at the soil surface where the shoulders of them pushed up. She pressed the soil back down around them and replaced the glass and turned to face the room. The stove had 2 splits left, one for tonight, one for morning. After that, there was no more wood. The last split of pine went into the stove at first light, and she did not open the firebox again. She had thought about this day for 5 days, the way you think about a thing you cannot stop and cannot change. Not with panic, but with a cold, deliberate inventory of every option that remained. The cabin was insulated well by the snow pressed against 3 walls, better than she had realized. The north and east drifts had climbed to the eave line and sat there like a packed earthen berm, and what they lost in light, they gained in insulation. The interior temperature, which had been dropping a degree per hour on the worst nights, now held and fell more slowly, the snow doing what snow does when it gets deep enough, blocking the wind, trapping whatever warmth was inside, turning the cabin into something closer to a root cellar than an open box. The root cellar principle. She had not thought of it in those terms before, but standing in the gray morning with the last fire burning down to coals and the children still asleep, she understood that what she had been building all along, the pit greenhouse, the compost heat, the glass seal, the stove warmth trapped by the snow walls, was a system. Not a single desperate trick, but a set of interlocking conditions that worked together the way a good machine works, each part supporting the next. The compost trench was still running warm. She checked it every morning, and it had not dropped below what she needed. The goat added her steady 6 degrees of ambient body heat to the south corner. The snow walls kept the wind out. The glass held the growing heat down in the pit. And the plants. The plants were producing oxygen. She had noticed it first on day 8 and dismissed it as imagination, but by day 10, she was certain. The air in the south half of the cabin, near the pit, was cleaner. She could not have explained the chemistry of it. She only knew that when she knelt close to the glass and breathed the air that seeped around the edges, it tasted different than the air at the north wall. Sweeter, less heavy. The children slept in the south half of the cabin, and she had moved their bedding there on day 9 without explaining why. On day 11, Agnes had said the words Ruth had been afraid to hear. "Mama, I can't breathe right." Not a complaint. A statement, quiet and factual, the way Agnes said most things. The girl had been sitting up in the blankets with a hand pressed to her sternum and a look on her face that was too old for 9 years old. Ruth had pressed her palm to the glass panel and said, "Come sit here." Agnes sat beside the pit and after a few minutes said she felt better. Ruth did not explain the why. She harvested what cress remained and fed it to all 3 children and told them they were eating the plants and the plants were sharing their air. Thomas said that was strange. Agnes said it made sense and went back to sleep. The radishes were ready on day 12. 6 of them, the size of a man's thumb, red-shouldered and firm, pulled from the soil and rinsed with the last clean water and divided among the children with a careful fairness that gave each child 2 full pieces. They were sharp and clean-tasting, and the children ate them in seconds and looked at her for more, and she showed them the empty ground where those radishes had been and told them there were more coming. The second sowing was already showing, another 8 days. She did not tell them she had planted the second sowing using the last of the seeds. The turnips were behind, always behind, but on day 13, she had pressed her finger into the soil in the turnip row and felt resistance. Not the soft crumble of loose soil, but the hard, round pressure of something that had been growing for 2 weeks underground and was nearly the size it intended to be. She replaced the glass and did not harvest them. 2 more days, 3 at most. On the morning of February 14th, with the last fire dying and the temperature inside the cabin sitting at 38 degrees at floor level and 44 at bench height, Ruth Calloway made a calculation. She had 4 turnips ready to pull. She had a second row of radishes showing their shoulders. She had a third sowing of winter cress already germinated in the section of the trench she had cleared and resown. She had a goat who was thin but alive. She had 3 children who were hungry but not starving. She had a silver mirror angled against the canvas, throwing the pale February light onto the plants with the focused attention of something that understood the stakes. She had enough. Not comfort, not safety. Enough. A different thing entirely. And on the Wyoming plain in February, it was everything. She pulled the 4 turnips and washed them and cut them into the iron pot with the last of the bone broth and set the pot on the still warm stovetop and let it sit. The turnips softened in the residual heat. It took longer than a proper boil would have taken, but she was not in a position to be particular about time. She fed the children at midday. Real food, warm, with substance to it. Marin ate with both fists and made sounds that indicated deep satisfaction. Thomas ate without making a face, which was as close to a compliment as Thomas got for anything. Agnes finished her portion and sat quietly for a moment, and then said, "When is Papa coming back?" Ruth said she expected him when the pass cleared. She did not say anything else because what she knew about Rolf's return was only this. If he was alive, he would come when he could, and if he was not coming, it was because the first storm had taken him the way the first storm had taken other men that season, and she would face that when she faced it. What she knew for certain was that she had kept these children alive through 16 days of white burial using a goat, a glass window, a seed packet, a compost trench, and her dead mother's mirror. Whatever came next, that fact was fixed and could not be taken back. The door opened on February 18th. She heard it before she could make sense of it. The sound of wood and frozen metal giving way. The particular sound of something being pushed from the outside. She was at the glass panel when it happened, checking the third sowing's root development, and she straightened up and looked at the door, and Rolf stood in the frame with snow on every surface of him, and a 50-pound flour sack over one shoulder, and an expression on his face that she did not know how to read, because it was too many things at once. He stood in the doorway looking at what the cabin had become, the floorboards missing from the south wall, the glass panel over the pit with its rows of green, the mirror angled against the canvas window, the goat watching him from her corner, the 3 children on the rope bed, alive and fed, and looking back at him. He set the flour sack down. He looked at his wife. She was thinner than he had left her. Her hands were cracked at every knuckle, and there was a burn scar on her left wrist from the stove she had not told him about in any letter, because there had been no way to send letters. She stood in the center of a floor she had ripped up and a cabin she had remade into something he did not have a name for, and she looked at him with the steady, level look of a woman who has nothing left to prove. He crossed the room and held her. She let him. Against his shoulder, she said very quietly, "I used the window." He said that was fine. She said, "And the floor." He said that was fine too. The children piled into them from both sides, and the goat came to investigate, and the turnip broth that had been sitting cold in the pot needed reheating, and there was flour now, enough for bread, and the seeds in the third sowing row were already showing their cotyledons, and the air in the south half of the cabin still tasted sweeter than the north, and none of it needed explaining to anyone who had lived inside it. It just needed to be true. It was. If Ruth's story pulled you in, hit the like button. It tells us to keep these stories coming. Subscribe to Wild West Survival Tales so you never miss the next character fighting to stay alive on the frontier. Drop a comment below. When the wood ran out and the cold was at 38 degrees, Ruth had one choice left: trust the plants or abandon the cabin. What would you have done? Because on this channel, the next survivor is already waiting.